From historic hospital museums boasting fascinating exhibits and horrifying paranormal activity, to former psychiatric treatment centers where the restless spirits of those lost to torturous experimentation still roam. Are you ready for the most haunted asylums in the United States? Number 5. Manteno State Hospital. Manteno State Hospital, spread across a 1,000-acre expanse in Manteno, Illinois, is a former psychiatric institution that, at one point in time, was considered one of the largest and most advanced facilities in existence. Historically, the center was initially authorized in 1927, with its first patients placed in 1930, but due to understaffing through the Great Depression, as well as through World War II, conditions were harsh to say the least, and early on, out of 120 total nurses, it was recorded that only 16 had actual training. The site's patient population hit its peak in 1954 at around 8,200, with 450 staff members, only 21 of which were actual registered nurses. And through the early 1960s, the facility's farming operations were shut down. Over the following decades, patient numbers would decline, and by 1985, the facility was forced to close its doors. Eventually, portions of the property were sold off, repurposed for use as a golf course, veterans home, residential developments, and more. Today, all buildings from the old institution, even the abandoned ones, are either privately or federally owned, and entry isn't allowed without express permission from owners, though the area surrounding is fully explorable. Chillingly, in 1939, more than 50 patients and staff members were lost to typhoid fever. In 1941, 462 died in an experiment, and it's speculated that many less than reputable procedures were performed on site, often without consent. Throughout the area, officials, residents, golfers, and others have reported orbs and mists in photographs, unnatural cold spots, and a host of full-bodied apparitions ranging from doctors to patients, random civilians, and more, all in clothing spanning the eras. One famous legend tells of a farmer who sold his land after unearthing several dead bodies in his fields. It was later discovered these bodies had belonged to a group of patients who'd escaped from the hospital, had become lost, and succumbed to the elements. Lastly, staff members and residents in the area report doors opening and closing on their own, disembodied voices and footsteps, and the constant feeling of never truly being alone. Number 4. Danvers State Hospital. Danvers State Hospital, formerly the State Lunatic Hospital at Danvers, and located off of Kirkbride Drive in Danvers, Massachusetts, is a former psychiatric hospital now acting as an apartment complex that's said to be the inspiration for H.P. Lovecraft's Arkham Sanatorium. Historically, the facility was opened in 1878, following 4 years of construction, as a self-contained institution built to serve the developmentally delayed and mentally ill, that boasted 2 main buildings, 4 wings, 4 dorms, a full kitchen, laundry room, and chapel. Over the years, the site welcomed on multiple new additions to the facility, with older buildings on site modernized along the way, and most connected by a tunnel. Through the 1930s, sadly, the hospital faced overcrowding with a patient populace of over 2,000, and even resorted to housing some of its patients in the basement. Budget cuts from the 1960s and onward would result in the closure of multiple wards, and eventually, in 1992, operations were ceased entirely. In 2005, the property was purchased by Avalon Bay Communities, who demolished all but the original structure, constructing an apartment complex called Bradley Danvers in place. Paranormal activity throughout the area is said to stem from before the hospital even existed, back to when the locality was recognized as Salem Village, a community infamous for its connections to the 1692 Salem witch trials. As history and legend have it, Judge Jonathan Hawthorne once resided where the asylum now stands, and it's speculated that many sentenced to death were hanged right at this very spot, their vengeful spirits left to wander. Chillingly, when the hospital was still in operation, a slew of official reports detailed disembodied footsteps in the attic during storms, shadowy figures sighted slinking to and from patients' rooms, and even encounters with apparitions in colonial-era garb, phenomena that persist into present times. And residents of the community frequently describe unnatural cold spots, objects that move on their own, orbs in photography, and doors that open and close by themselves as parts of daily life. Lastly, the Asylum Cemetery holds the remains of around 770 patients, most of which were buried as nothing more than numbers, and those passing by at night have reported sighting ghostly figures roaming, seemingly searching for proper resting places. Number 3. Rolling Hills Asylum. Rolling Hills Asylum, located in East Bethany, New York, is a former poorhouse turned tourist attraction that's grounds have since been transformed into the Genesee County Park and Forest. Historically, through the 1700s, the site played home to a stagecoach tavern, with the institution opening much later in 1827 as the Genesee County Poorhouse. The operation was initially self-sufficient, with residents split between labor, animal tending, shopkeeping, and chores. But in 1828, following a string of incidents, facilities were constructed for residents deemed dangerous or unpredictable. In 1938, the site was repurposed and utilized as the Genesee County Infirmary, and through the 1960s, it was altered to accommodate a nursing home until its closure in 1974. In 2009, the property was purchased by one Sharon Coyle, who set to work on a series of extensive renovations, reopening it as Rolling Hills Asylum. As of 2021, Rolling Hills Asylum acts as a major tourist destination, hosting historical tours, educational events, a range of paranormal research, and even haunted houses. Activity surrounding Rolling Hills is said to stem from its Potter's Field Cemetery, which holds the bodies of roughly 1,700 on-site deaths, with possibly hundreds more unrecorded. While there is a marker in memoriam of the cemetery, whatever headstones once stood have long since faded, and, disturbingly, no one is certain exactly where the old graveyard actually lies. Across the site, both staff and visitors have reported disembodied voices, doors slamming on their own, footsteps from empty areas, and EVPs in the backgrounds of recordings and phone calls. One famous legend tells of Roy, a patient at the infirmary who was born with gigantism and whom died in 1942. A number of accounts describe run-ins with a towering 7-foot-tall shadow entity thought to be his restless spirit that, rather tragically, is often heard crying through the darkness. Also reported across the property are orbs visible to the naked eye, half-formed figures that appear later in photographs, and full-bodied apparitions in clothing spanning the ages. A final story tells of one nurse, Emmy Altworth, who was recognized for her cruelty towards both fellow staff members and patients. Emmy's apparition has been sighted roaming the building, has been known to emit an uncomfortable vibe, and has even touched, grabbed, and slapped unsuspecting visitors. Number 2. The Public Hospital Museum. The Public Hospital Museum, located off West Francis Street in Williamsburg, Virginia, is a former psychiatric institution turned museum that's recognized as the first hospital of its kind in the entirety of the United States. Historically, the facility was initially constructed between 1771 and 1773 as the public hospital for persons of insane and disordered minds, making it the first long-term mental care facility in the country. Through the early 19th century, the institution's name was changed to Eastern State Hospital, and in 1859, in an attempt to keep up with an ever-increasing patient populace, the campus was expanded. By the late 1800s, the site's buildings had begun to fall into disrepair, and in 1885, a large fire destroyed 6 of its 7 structures. The hospital alone was reconstructed and remained in operation until 1968, when Eastern State Hospital was relocated entirely and the old property was donated to Colonial Williamsburg. The original 1773 hospital building was eventually and meticulously reconstructed, and in 1985 the building was opened up to the public as a museum purposed to showcase the history of mental health care in the US. Sadly, this old facility played witness to some of the most brutal days of medicine, and it's speculated that many died within at the hands of borderline torturous treatments. Hauntings on site are said to be a direct result of this dark past, with both staff and visitors frequently reporting disembodied voices, chilling moaning, footsteps from empty spaces, and the sounds of chains rattling. Strange gusts of wind are felt inside the building when it's completely sealed. Beds in the museum often appear slept in overnight, and a range of full-bodied apparitions have been encountered. Also reported at the Public Hospital Museum are doors opening and closing on their own, objects that move by themselves or disappear entirely, and the constant feeling of being watched by someone or something unseen. A final legend tells of one Dr. John Minson Galt II, who became superintendent of the facility in 1841. In 1862, with the Battle of Williamsburg looming at the height of the Civil War, Galt took his own life within his home on hospital grounds. Following his passing, and despite numerous cleanings, it's said a large bloodstain persisted in his former abode at his death site. Though this old home has long since been torn down, many claim Galt's restless spirit remains, forever wandering museum grounds. Number 1. Forest Haven Asylum. Forest Haven Asylum, located on the grounds of Fort Meade in Laurel, Maryland, is an abandoned former insane asylum that's grown wildly in infamy regarding its dark past and purported paranormal infestations. Historically, the facility opened its doors in 1925 as the District Training School for the Mentally Retarded, a farm-like institution focused on educating its patients, and in 1928 it held its first on-site burial. In 1963, around the same time it began accepting a wider range of disabilities, the institution's title was altered to Forest Haven. Sadly, overcrowding, underfunding, and incidentally, understaffing would lead to Forest Haven's steady decline and increased mistreatment of its patients, and in 1987, enraged families would actually erect a memorial stone in honor of an estimated 389 who, it was discovered, were buried carelessly in a mass grave. In 1991, after years of alleged abuse, medical incompetence, and countless deaths, the facility was forced to close its doors under order of federal judgment. Today, the property remains abandoned and in a state of decay, and being on government lands is heavily patrolled. Those lucky enough to get permission to explore around should exercise extreme caution, as the old campus's buildings are literally crumbling in on themselves. Chillingly, bodies from the many horrifying deaths on site, those resulting from abuse, neglect, and experimentation, were passed through the asylum's morgue in the basement before being laid to rest in what would, over time, form the mass grave mentioned previously. Though a marker with an estimated count was erected, no one knows for certain exactly how many bodies lie beneath the facility's surface. Reported by officials, specialists, and those fortunate enough to explore Forest Haven are orbs visible to the naked eye, strange mists that float with seeming sentience, EVPs in the backgrounds of phone calls and radio transmissions, frequent electronic malfunctions, and eerie figures that appear later in the backgrounds of photographs. Throughout the old institution's halls, a number of equipment remains, and stories tell of empty beds creaking as if someone is in them, of balls that float in midair, and of wheelchairs rolling on their own, even chasing the living. Also reported across the campus are disembodied voices, footsteps from empty areas, doors that open and close on their own, and the eerie sounds of children crying for their parents, always heard from just out of sight. Lastly, throughout Forest Haven, many have encountered the full-bodied apparitions of doctors, nurses, children, and patients, going about daily life as if unaware they're dead. Taking into consideration its fascinatingly dark history, range of paranormal activity, and long list of local legends and ghost stories, we felt Forest Haven was the perfect choice as our pick for the most haunted asylum in the United States. Thanks for tuning in to our list of picks for some of the most haunted asylums in the United States. If you enjoyed hearing our histories and ghost stories as much as we enjoyed telling them to you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn notifications on so you know when fresh content is on the way. Throw us a like if you feel we've earned it, and, most importantly, share this upload and our channel with anyone you think deserves a good scare. We'll see you all next time.